Hi, grade nines. In this video, we're going to be talking about reading strategies. Now, you might be asking, why are we going to talk about reading strategies in grade nine? I already know how to read. And that's a great question, which I'm going to address on our next slide. So, why are we talking about reading strategies? There are three reasons why we're going to talk about these today. The first reason is that these strategies that I'm going to talk about, these tools essentially for your toolkit, they're going to help us engage more with the ideas that we're reading, make connections with them so that they stick a little bit better in our minds. They're also going to help us better understand the ideas that are being communicated. Maybe you've read something in the past and you didn't quite understand it, it didn't make sense. These reading strategies will hopefully help you understand more the ideas being communicated. And finally, the third reason why we're going to talk about reading strategies is that they're going to ensure that we aren't just reading the words or looking at the words. Perhaps you're like me, sometimes you get a little distracted and you're just saying the words out loud or saying the words in your mind. You're not actually computing anything. I know that I do that sometimes and I have to go back to the beginning of the paragraph. We want to make sure that we aren't doing that. So these reading strategies we're going to talk about today are going to help us with all three of these things. Now, the reading strategies we're talking about today are broken into three groups based on when during our reading, we're going to use these strategies. So the first group is before, the next one is during, and the last one is after reading. So there are some reading strategies for before we start reading, there's reading strategies for during reading, and some after. Let's get started. So before we start reading, believe it or not, there are some things that we're going to do to help us better understand what we're reading. The first thing that you want to do before you start reading is activate any prior knowledge. So this is where we brainstorm about the topic, usually based on the title of the news article or the title of the novel or the pictures we're seeing. We can kind of get an idea of the topic that we're going to be reading about. So it's a good idea to brainstorm what you already know about that and to determine how much you already know. Do you know a lot about this topic? Do you know maybe a little bit about the topic? You've heard of the topic before, you're familiar with it, and so you know a little bit. Maybe you don't know anything. So determine how much you already know. Some things I want you to be thinking about as you try to activate your prior knowledge, or some sentence starters to help you as you're thinking about this are, I know about this. Maybe that's something that you already know about this topic. Maybe you've heard this idea before. I've heard about this before. I don't know a lot about it. Or what's a really interesting connection you might be able to make is that it's happened to you. This has happened to me, right? If you're reading a news article, you're like, oh, this happened to me, or reading a story about a journey to the beach. Maybe you've been before. So the first thing you want to do before we even start reading is try to brainstorm what you already know about the topic and how much you already know. The second thing you want to do before you start reading is try to make some predictions. So predicting is when you try to guess what's going to happen. Or you can guess what the text is going to be about. Maybe this is something you do in movies a lot. I know I like to do it. I like to try and guess what's going to happen next. Have you ever been reading a story or watching a movie, made a prediction about what was going to happen next, and it came true? Maybe you have. I know I do that. My husband hates it because often I'm right. But that's one of the things you can do. So if we're reading a story or reading a news article, try to predict what will happen or what it's going to be about. It engages our mind before we start reading. And so the chapter titles, the news article title, that can all help us, or the pictures we're even seeing can give us hints about what's going to happen next. Some things that sentence starters or ways to think about prediction is, I think blank will happen, or I believe it will be about, this story will be about, or this news article will be about. So make a prediction. And I'm going to click on to the next slide. I'm going to take a minute and ask you a question. Do you remember what the two strategies for before reading are? Take a minute and try to see if you remember. Okay, hopefully you remembered. Now that we finished with the things we do before reading, we're going to talk about what we do during reading. So while you're reading a story, there are two things that I want you to do while reading. And maybe these are things you already do, but if you aren't already doing them, there's some really great strategies. The first one is to try and visualize. So try to make a picture in your mind of what is happening. Maybe it's an action sequence. Maybe it's the author's describing a scene, what a character looks like. Try to picture it in your head. It helps you connect more with the story. Some things you can be thinking about is, I envision this part in my head to be, right? This is what I'm seeing in my head, this this building or this character. When I read this part, I see this. And the last one, maybe you get super nerdy like myself and you sketch out a diagram or a map. I do this a lot of times in stories when there's a lot of characters and I'm trying to remember how they're all connected, but trying to or there's a world that's been created and there's a map. Trying to visualize different parts of the story, help us remember it a little bit better, and make more connections. So that's the first thing we want to do while we're reading, is try to visualize what's going on. The second thing we're going to be doing while we're reading is summarizing. So this helps us determine the most important information, determine what we need to remember the most from each chapter or from the news article. Some things we can be thinking about are, what is the main idea of this section? As a heads up, we're going to be doing a lot of this. We're going to be trying to figure out what is the main idea of this news article, of this story, of this chapter. Sometimes, though, pieces are long, and so we can't just figure out the main idea. We might have to talk about the top 5 events or the top 5 topics. So what are the top 5 things that happened in this part of the story? But while we're reading, we kind of want to summarize as we go, especially those longer portions, so we can remember the most important information. So I'm going to click on the next screen, but I'm going to ask you the same question I asked you before. What were those 2 strategies that you should be using while you're reading? Okay, hopefully you remembered. The last part we're going to talk about is after reading. So just because we finished reading does not mean our strategies are over, doesn't mean we should stop engaging with what we're reading. There are some strategies to help us better understand what we're reading after we're finished. So the first one is questions. So sometimes when you've read something, you don't understand everything. There's some things we need clarity on. So we have questions to ask. So we need to try and clarify what we don't already understand about the topic. So maybe there were some words that were used that we didn't quite understand, or things that were mentioned we didn't understand. What are some questions we still have after reading this article or this story? Some things to be thinking about. I am really confused about. Is there something that confused you that you didn't quite understand? I didn't understand. What was something that you didn't understand? And finally, I need clarity on. So these are just some different sentence starters to help you figure out what you still have questions on after finishing reading this story or news article. The last strategy for after reading is to make connections. And this is super important. This is what makes the learning last, right? By helping you connect with the reading based on your experiences. So making these connections really will make it stand out in your memory. You're going to remember it more later going on. There's 3 different kinds of connections that you can make. The first one is a connection to yourself. So we call this text to self connections. It's something that you can relate to because you've experienced it in your own life. So maybe your story, as I mentioned before, is going to the beach, and that's something you've done before. So you can relate to it because you've done that before. The second connection you can make is text, what we call text to text. And a text can be anything. It can be a story, it can be a news article, it could be a movie, something that you've read or seen before, and maybe even a music, like an album or a song. So making connections, those sorts of connections. So maybe you've seen a movie about someone going to the beach, and so you can make a connection in that way. And then the last connection you can make is what we call text to world. And this is where you've seen somewhere in the world, maybe it's on the news or it was in social media, where you've seen this happen. So maybe you've seen a social media post about the beach, or you've learned something in the news about the beach. And so that you can make a connection that way. So we try to make connections in 3 different ways: text to self, text to text, and text to world. All right, before we move on to the practice part, I'm going to ask you one final question. What were the 2 strategies that I gave you to use after you finish reading? Hopefully you got them. Now that you've learned about these different strategies, the before reading, during reading, and after reading strategies, it's time to practice. I've got a news article for you to read, and you're going to try and use all of these strategies before, during, and after. Good luck.